It's my great pleasure now to introduce the last session before we have in the evening again a revisit of deep time Chinese culture and technologies. In the afternoon we will listen to three speakers, three presentations, and discuss with them very differently. The first will be Andrés Burbano from Colombia, and the second one will be Marcelo Mercado, who lives for a while already in Germany, but he comes from Argentine, and this is also how we met many years ago. And third and last and not least, our friend and colleague Amador Vega from Barcelona. I will introduce them, of course, individually. First speaker is Andrés Burbano. I can't even remember, Andrés, when we met the first time. This is not important, but for me, you have become an important reference for a project which is extremely important, not only for South America, but also for other areas, including, for example, our Europe, including Hungary. Namely, the investigation of possibilities of expression between the arts, sciences, and technology beyond a given point of the first, of an origin, which is, of course, in South America very strongly connected with the arrival of the Spanish imperators, the Spanish hegemonial power, which changed the continent tremendously and very fundamentally. Today it's extremely difficult to go back, even for the scholars in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, to go back behind the arrival of the Europeans and to investigate how communication, how media, before the term was even existing, were coined in your countries. We are quite happy that meanwhile there are young scholars investigating this field quite strongly. I have a few PhD students who are working on pre-Columbian media, which is wonderful, and who are investigating this very, very important deep time history. We always forget, we, the Europeans, we always forget that we are developed by the South and not the other way around. This is why this term, developing countries, is absolutely silly. We had been developed by the South, not only as a form of living, but as the culture which was perhaps in the earliest stage of civilization able not only to concentrate of immediate survival, but also on the luxury of thinking and of doing other things. We, the barbarians, always were too busy with survival. Anyway, Andrés is investigating since quite a few years on deep time constellations of art, sciences, and technology in Colombia. He is assistant professor at the School of Architecture and Design at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, where I had the pleasure to be for a while some years ago, and where we did great seminars together, again under conditions which are not so easy, which have been even more difficult perhaps 10 years ago. Now Colombia is as we can see in the news and read in the newspapers, changing quite a lot, and we are all, of course, very curious to see what comes out of it. But we should not only be curious, we should also try in our way to interfere into such processes in building up cooperations, in supporting ideas. This is, by the way, the same way how we can help and support a situation which Miklos has in Hungary and others have in other countries. We can start to cooperate and help them to get their things better through, perhaps, than it is possible at the moment. Andrés has made a PhD at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He was away for a while from Colombia, but he went back, which is great, to his old university, where he is teaching now and researching. Please welcome Andrés Burbano.
Okay. Can we have this machine working? Let me check if, okay, this. Can you hear me? Good. So, my presentation will spin around three concepts: fieldwork, autonomy, and play. I will spend more time talking about the first one because it will be related to some of my practical work as a researcher and as a media artist. And the other two will come and, let's say, try to generate like another point of view of this fieldwork idea. So let's start first with the idea of the lab. What is a lab? And especially thinking and questioning why this idea of the media labs are pervasive in our contemporary scene, in the media arts, and asking why this idea has been so influential everywhere. Let's say today we have this media lab in Helsinki, in Madrid, in Prado, in Bogota, in many places around the world. However, I think there is not much interesting and deep literature about why this model of the media lab has been transferred, translated, sometimes with a little process of digestion of the same idea of the media lab. So every time I try to go back to the history of the media labs, it comes the idea of the foundations of the MIT Media Lab in 1985, when Professor Nicolas Negroponte and Jeroen Wijsner created this lab inside the urban planning unit there in MIT. This should be contextualized with the changes in the States, especially the apparition of the PC, the personal computer, the apparition of the Macintosh, the first personal computer with a graphical operating system, and also with the Reagan administration. In his book, Being Digital, Nicolas Negroponte, 10 years after founding the MIT Media Lab, proposes a series of concepts to discuss the technological present at a time. And I must say, if these concepts represent the philosophy of the MIT Media Lab, I think most of them today are mainly useless. There are still some interesting concepts like unwieldy atoms, for instance, this idea of atoms that couldn't be controlled. But eventually, in these post-digital times, the idea of being digital is not necessarily precise. The idea of being beyond demographics probably contradicts all our political present these days and the importance of demographics in the changing of our contemporary world. And just to mention another one, this idea of separating or thinking on places without spaces, like to think about like cyberspace or something like that, it's also very questionable today. I'm in favor of deeply thinking and practicing and creating in the intersection of the notions of place and space. When I try to get scholarly informed texts about the history of the media labs, it is very interesting to see there is not much about it, despite has been very influential. And that's one thing that I don't really why this is happening. I found interesting literature, for instance, in Spain, but it's more like a chronological explanation. You know, first we have this model of the Media Lab here, and eventually we have this model of the Media Lab there, and so on and so forth. But nothing very serious. Interestingly enough, I found this publication that is currently going on. It's going to be published this year by Jussi Parikka and Lori Emerson, that is called the Lab Book. And they are asking, why is a Media Lab? And thinking that the first Media Lab at the MIT was founded in the 80s, asking this question today, it's really, it's kind of like a, you know, it's coming very late. So I think it's very necessary to work in this direction, but also question the approaches that eventually Jussi and Lori have about this. So there are some quotes of his publication or the website that is announcing the publication. They said, Media Labs, hacker zones, maker spaces, humanities labs, fab labs, tech incubators, innovation centers, hack labs, and media archaeology labs, they are everywhere, and we can't stop talking about them. The point is exactly that until now, there has not been that much literature about these topics. That is very strange. I would like to point out to 3 interesting questions that you're asking in the book. The first one is why media labs are so important and why they play such an important role in contemporary discourse. What is the relationship between media labs and the idea of the corporate university? That is a key question. And they ask also eventually for other places that could replace or complement the idea of the media lab. So I must say that this idea of the lab is very interesting in some aspects. For instance, I found very inspiring the connection that has been mobilized by the Media Lab in the sense of connecting some research practices that belong to the sciences and the technical domains into the media arts practice. That's a positive, let's say, mixing of knowledges and negotiation. However, I think the labs, the idea of being inside one space, it's a sedentary notion of experimental work. And if we work in a lab, we probably experience the risk of missing the world outside. So instead of working in media labs or working exclusively in labs, I would like to propose the notion of fieldwork. Why fieldwork? Fieldwork because it connects our practice as media artists and researchers with fantastic intellectual traditions with long experiences in the fieldwork like biology, ornithology, zoology, archaeology, anthropology, or ethnography. I think we need to engage with them and create better tools to go outside and explore. Also challenges our intellectual sedentarism, you know, the idea that we can solve everything, you know, sit down in one place. It challenges our equipment, that is very important to me, you know, traveling 10 days, and the only thing that connects you with the solution you are trying to find or the problem you are trying to formulate is the duration of your battery, the battery life, 3 hours, for instance, right, of one camera or one sensor. Other aspects are like it goes beyond, of course, indoor solutions. It pushes ourselves out of comfort zones and plug us into the world. I would like now to mention some of the projects that I've done that involve seriously fieldwork. The first one I did that was important is called Chiasma. It was like an interactive documentary about celebrations and violence in my country, in Colombia. I had the opportunity to travel to like 15 different places. Another reference could be, I don't know if any of you attended to ICEA 2012 in Albuquerque. I was the person in charge of bringing one of the code talkers to speak in the conference. No one? You know what the code talkers are? Code talkers, Navajo code talkers. We were able to bring one of them and ask him to tell his story. Yeah, that was first time probably that we had an indigenous person speaking as a keynote in ICEA. And this idea of the code talkers, I mean, this whole story is just mind-blowing. Another project is the Newtonites, one experiment that we did. I will show some documentation in the dunes in California. One work I've been doing with Professor George Legrady, who is Hungarian, in the northern Canada, in Quebec. And some recent work I've been doing in Mexico and Colombia. So let me start talking about the project that we are doing at the James Bay in northern Canada. This map shows at the route of several trips that we did together with Professor Legrady from Montreal to Chisasibi in this region that is called the James Bay in Canada. Is the Canadian subarctic and Arctic. And the idea is that in the 72, George Legrady was invited to go to document the way of life of the Cree people, the indigenous communities up there. At that time, they were facing an equalization because the Canadian government was building the largest dam ever built at a time in the world. Interestingly enough, George asked me to join him in this effort of bringing back 4,000 pictures that he took when he went to the Canadian subarctic in the 70s, and asked me to be part of the team doing the visual documentation. These are some of the pictures that he made with his brother and a couple of other photographers, 4,000 pictures. That is incredibly valuable material today, especially the Cree people like this material a lot. You know, they can see pictures of them when they were kids, or a picture of one of his parents or grandparents and things like that. So the entire project has this idea of taking this information back to the Cree communities. So my first day in the Canadian subarctic, I was in this boat, very happy, testing my equipment, and suddenly my camera fell into the freezing waters of the Canadian subarctic. So I was thinking what to do. I decided to jump in, shoes off, and try with my feet to carefully find the camera and recover my footage. And finally, luckily, I was able to bring the camera back and to somehow gain the respect of the people around me, because they said, okay, this guy really loves his stuff and his devices and the tools for documentation. But this was my baptism in the Arctic waters. And at the same time, it was let's say, how to say this? It's when I experience in my own body the idea of being immersed in the landscape. Okay, immersion is not something that could happen when you put a helmet on your head, but eventually when you change your temperature and you try to look with your feet, trying to find something. So at the end of the project that finished last year, I was able to produce around 150 short videos of the Cree way of life and the process of bringing the pictures back there. But honestly, despite I considered that work was interesting enough, and especially the people there like it, that the most important contribution that I did was actually to find some of the people like him who, since the 40s, more or less, and especially in the 60s, were the Cree members of the community who were doing photography. So thinking in the Kamal's presentation this morning about the nature of cinema, this happened like 100 kilometers south of the island where Nanook was filmed. And this was a tantalizing thing to know when I was there, because this relationship between image, power, and documentation was always in my mind. And for me, it was very important to find, to see how the Crees represent themselves. So I finally found this lady who had like a collection of 400 pictures by her. And that was included, obviously, in our collection. So this is the first example. Let's jump now from the freezing north to the California coast. This is a project that I had the opportunity to conduct with some friends of mine in California. It's called the Nude Nights, and it is related to the history of cinema, too. So these are the dunes in California. And in this landscape we are looking at now, there was one built, the largest set for a movie ever built. It was an Egyptian city built for the Ten Commandments movie. First version of the Cecil B. DeMille. And after the film was completed, they decided to dynamite the set, because it was huge, gigantic, and to prevent rival producing houses from using it. So there is this spot where around 20 of these sphinxes are still underground. We discovered that with the project somehow. And that's the Egyptian city that was that. That's not a trick, that existed in that size, okay? So today you can find this amazing mix of archaeological artifacts, archaeology in the sense that these are treasures like archaeology of fiction in the States. And we decided to do a project. This time we did a lot of research on what are the tools that were needed to explore this place. So I put together a team of fantastic people, some people with deep knowledge on fieldwork. We developed our own tools. For instance, I was into balloons with helium, attaching cameras and then creating orthophotographic maps in order to see where to look first, and then move into the regions that were selected with other pieces of technology. You're going to see that now. So this is where the first maps we did. And we decided then to explore with that piece of equipment that is called a ground penetrating radar that gives you information of what is underneath. And we designed a strategy on how to create the model that was there in order to, let's say, achieve this idea of the visualization of information, of making visible the invisible, exploring what is underneath. Finally, we designed a piece of software that took the data from the GPR, and when you change the level of energy, you can see the stratification there. The level of energy that bounces, we were able to find several things there in a row that turned out to be the sphinxes that are still hidden in the California coast as reminders of this complexity of our culture, Egyptian city buried in the California coast. This shows how quickly time travels in California, where things that are less than 100 years old are already archaeology. And of course, it's evident that the questions I had at the time in mind were related to media archaeology, deep time of media, archaeology of fiction, and history of cinema. But something very interesting happened there, because we joined one archaeologist in the team. He was fascinated with our way of working there in the field. He said, "Hey guys, I would like to go to the field once, in the place where I do my archaeological research, and bring you there with this methodology that you designed that intuitively, right? Like aerial photography, GPR, combining all of them and trying to do some interpretations with software." So we said, okay, sure, yeah, we would love to go, right? It sound like a good intention. So finally, 2 years ago, he was kind enough to invite us to go to the place that he does research. It is in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, close to the Caribbean, and we were in charge of documenting and generating orthophotographic maps of an ancient Maya city. I cannot describe the joy and happiness that I experience in moments like this, where me and my colleague Gabriel Sea are flying quadricopters in the top of a more than 2,000-old pyramid in order to negotiate our practice with the archaeologists doing research there, American and Mexican archaeologists. Look at this fantastic site. You can see from here, from the top of this pyramid, Chichen Itza, for instance, that is not that far away. And several questions about the nature of our ancient times came to our minds, as you can imagine. One of the things that is really interesting to see is this very rare circular pyramid that we found there. I mean, the archaeologists found there, and we were able to help them document. There are like 2 of these, and on contrary of what we saw in the presentation of Greek buildings and so on, despite this is a very complex city that embeds a lot of practices on knowledge and so on, we don't know how was this space used, unfortunately. But there's interesting people trying to figure out how we can eventually dynamize that knowledge that is embedded there. So this is the map that we finally did for the archaeologists. Look at this. This is how Google Maps represents the place, and this is how we got a much better resolution of the map. And we learned a lot about the negotiations of archaeological knowledge related to images and what they are looking for and so on. This is an invitation, of course, of engaging more with our ancient technologies, with an ancient cities. So just to briefly mention my current work in this open field, explorations. I'd like to say that now in Colombia, there is a super rich country in terms of ornithology diversity. I've been this is a long story, but I've been involved in bird watching and bird listening. Okay, one example is this beautiful bird that lives in the coffee region there in Colombia. And also, again, exploring the richness of the landscape of my own country, diversity of biology. And one thing that I decided to do in this one, that now that we are thinking in education and so on, is I have a 7-year-old daughter. Sorry, got emotional. And I decided to invite her to join me in the crew, with the documentary, as you told me yesterday. So she became the most brilliant kind of researcher there. We did for 3 days, 4 trips every day from 5 in the morning to 9 at night. She joined all of the trips with books and taking notes and so on. And this was for me an opportunity to share my world with her. That when I told her about my trips to the Arctic and so on, she thinks of me oh, this is an end of the world or something like that, right? So she's been first of great use because she identifies very quickly, for instance, birds, like songs and so on. And for me, it's an opportunity to explore other ways of education for her, of course. Learning more about this fantastic nature that we have around. And it has, of course, lots of knowledge that I can teach. So, just to close this section, with these kind of experiences, I go for the value of the outdoor experience, the value of the open spaces, the use of open technologies when possible, and especially open minds and open hearts. So that's the section of fieldwork. Autonomy. I would like to introduce to you to the work of anthropologist Arturo Escobar. He is probably the most important Colombian thinker that is living. He's professor at the University of North Carolina in the States, has been for a while. And it's a fantastic thinker. He's part of this the colonial movement in the States, that is like the somehow equivalent or similar to the post-colonial movement, intellectual movement in the UK and in Europe. But he has a particular take on this decolonial discourse that is, in my opinion, incredibly relevant for the condition of Latin America, because, let's say, most of Latin American countries, especially in South America, became independent like 200 years ago. So sometimes like the coloniality, and it's a strange way of looking at our past. However, he focuses on one process that started in the 50s that is incredibly important, and I think ideologically heavily charged as the coloniality. That is the idea of development that Siegfried also mentioned briefly in the introduction. And he has proposed this idea of the post-development, right? So development is one very strange way to explain the differences of richness and in the countries in the world, right? He wrote this fantastic book that is called Encountering Development, the Making and Unmaking of the Third World, and he deconstructs the idea of the third world when we started to talk about it, what is the difference between first and third and second world, and if it really makes sense to talk about that today. And the idea of development, for instance, that there are countries that are underdeveloped that should develop now. He starts with one analysis showing that most of the initiatives, if not every initiative, to transform an underdeveloped country in a developed one has failed. So that's something that we must face carefully. But right now, he's moving forward, not just with this idea of, there is something coming that is the post-development, but he is into the idea that we must build it together, right? And he is going back to the ideas of design. He's seriously interested in design, in the practices of co-design, and he just published one fantastic book called Autonomía y Diseño in Spanish, a PDF for free for Latin American countries. And the same publication will appear in few months in Duke University Press under the title, beautiful title, Designs for the Pluriverse. And here he proposes that design is the probably most adequate tool we have to design this post-development stage. Thinking about cultural and ecological transitions, we can say also in the context of this conference, potential spaces, how we can design these transitions, how we can create an ontological approach to design, how this relationship between autonomy, design, and the political consciousness can lead us to these transitions of potential spaces, right? Again, contextualizing to the context of this conference. He places the notion of autonomy in the center of design, but the most important conceptual twist is that he doesn't understand autonomy as a process for the individual or the self. He heavily criticizes the idea of the individual, like in the liberal tradition, Bentham and so on. And he proposes that the autonomy should be placed in the role of the community. So in this case, I come to you and say, we are a community. Eventually, we can work in this project together. He does this with a lot of knowledge on the current political situation of the world and how political autonomy and cultural autonomy can play an important role to enrich our experience in the world. Currently in Bogota, right now, I'm running a seminar, for instance, with the idea of comparing his thoughts with some of the philosophy of this book, The Stack. Probably some of you know, like this professor of University of California, San Diego, Benjamin H. Bratton. So to change the seriousness of the topics a little bit, I would like to close with the other concept I would like to share with you, that is the play. And this section especially has a good karma, I think, because several of the things that I would like to present briefly here are related to some of the exhibitions that are here right now in the ZKM, right? We have like this exhibition of play and game, for instance. And there are like two things that motivated me to talk about this thing. One is one conscious and one is one unconscious. So I will start with the unconscious. When I was 17 years old, I was finishing high school in my hometown in Pasto, Colombia, in the south of Colombia. And some friends of mine who were older came to me to invite me to a trip. So let's drive 4 hours and go to the, let's say, the beginning of the Amazon rainforest. So I decided to join the team. And when we went there, he told me, okay, what we are going to do is we are going to a ayahuasca ceremony. If you would like to join us. I said, sure, why not? I did, at the time, I didn't know much about the thing. So I finally participated in this ceremony, which was very interesting. But to me, it was a little bit awkward experience because I had a drink, the ayahuasca tea, and all night long, what I got were visions like a video games, like a Mario, 8 bits, visions like, and levels, up. Next morning, everybody was sharing visions, right? And all of them say, no, I saw like a white eagle or a snake. And for me, I was kind of ashamed to say, no, I saw like 8 bits video games, something like that. However, this image, of course, and that stayed in my mind for a long while. So just to contextualize again with another exhibition here in the CERCAM, this happened exactly where William Burroughs wrote the book Las Cartas del Yagé, the letters of Yagé. Yagé is another name for ayahuasca. So this is the unconscious experience. Now let's go for the conscious. I was in Brazil like 3 years ago, doing some research about one programming language that is called the Lua programming language. It's a fantastic scripting language that's been written in Brazil in University Católica de Rio. And this is a powerful scripting language that is one of the 2 programming languages that are increasing in use in the world that were not written in the States. One is Lua in Brazil, and one is Ruby in Japan, right? So I was doing research about this thing, and I discovered, thanks to this amazing book about the topic by a Russian scholar who lives in Canada, that most of the first applications of this programming language were done in the field of games. So I said, okay, definitely I need to know more about games and the things that are produced with this programming language. Some are produced with this, and others, of course, not. So I decided to engage in this idea of exploring the video games produced in Colombia. I designed it while traveling an exhibition, and I got a lot of interesting information. And I could identify that it was interesting in the scene of video games that are discussing, as cinematography discussed some decades ago, the reality of our countries. Now there are like some examples in the video game scene that was surprising to me. Let me show you briefly the video of one of my favorite video games produced by a Colombian team. They are based in Bogota, in Canada, that is called Papo and Me. The company is called Minority. And this explores the life of one kid who has a real problem. His father is an alcoholic and is transformed into a monster in the game. It's actually a biographical experience of the guy who made the game. And he designed this game in a collaboration with a lot of other artists in Latin America, in Colombia, and in Brazil. For instance, all the graffitis that you can see there were made by graffiti artists based in Rio de Janeiro too. So I've been trying to make sense of this game production in South America, and I found this very interesting book by Philip Phoenix Tatsen, who wrote this dissertation on video games and Latin America, exploring several levels of the relationship between games and Latin America. The cover is fantastic, in my opinion. And there are like interesting arguments. Like, for instance, this is Lara Croft exploring the ancient Maya site, one real ancient Maya site. And I need to accept that the first time that I saw this Maya site was through this game. And now I am in the process of going back to the real places where these things took place. And again, with my favorite assistant, exploring the ludicity of these places. Why ludicity? Because one of the few things that we know about the Maya cities is that that was a particular place for a game that is like similar to basketball, but played with the elbows and knees. And with this image of myself inside of a cenote in Mexico, I would like to say thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Andrés, for this insight into your or parts of your family experiences. I hope I got everything. I couldn't remember anymore how fast you can speak. Especially this is not your native language. Where shall we start? Perhaps one thing which is very interesting for us to know and to learn, these field studies you were describing at the beginning in the first block, were they contextualized through your university work, through your work at the art school in Bogota, or was this free work which was completely independent from the university? Was this somehow incorporated in your academic research and activities?
Yeah. So the first two examples were contextualized in my work in California, at University of California. And the last one, the last example with the birds, it's part of one research project I'm conducting, and it has funding from my university. The thing that I can tell you is that the more I think about the value of fieldwork, these days all the classes I teach in Bogota involve somehow in one way or another the experience of fieldwork.
Mm-hmm. And the background of my question is if the young students are also involved in such kind of fieldwork. Your daughter is involved, definitely, but we develop here, for example, a program which we call Archivists in Residence, which is also very strongly on the activity of working with the past or the testimonies of the past and transform them into something which you can work with in the present or even in the future. Are the young people involved in that, the students in this kind of project?
For instance, we designed one class that is called, it's a series of classes, 4 classes that have like the same topic and try to develop one final project. Mm-hmm. We have one what is called Colombia, in the sense that my university is located in Bogota, and most of the cities in South America have this centralistic political condition, let's say. And what we are trying to do is to develop projects outside of Bogota. So this includes like at least 1 or 2 weeks working in one particular place out of Bogota. This time we're working in the Atlantic coast, and it involves trips, and it's been a great experience, especially for the young students who live just in Bogota. They don't know the country and the differences and the living conditions of people. So in that sense, is remarkably interesting for them, and they approach us to tell that. And other strategies that I follow is, for instance, I have one class that is called Agile Technologies, with the idea of working with fast prototyping. And this semester, I'm working around the bike paths of Bogota. And one of the challenges is that every time they come to the class, they will need to use a different way of transportation. And just that experience enriches a lot what they are bringing as solutions and problem formulations.
And if you allow a jump into the third part, very interesting. I remember that you talked earlier about that is this Lua software, this software which has been developed completely independently from Silicon Valley or whatever. Are there connections between Lua and earlier traditions of algorithmic let's say cultures or devices in South America, especially in Colombia?
Yeah, the team that developed Lua is based in Brazil, and let's say this is a successful programming language that they develop. You can't imagine the complexity that implies the designing of a programming language. You know, like programming is difficult, understanding basic structures, but programming is one thing. Designing a language is another level of complexity. And this team, they work like almost for 25 years to designing different levels of other languages to finally get this language done. The main difference of this language with previous examples by the same team or other teams that are close to them was that they got MIT free license. And eventually people could start using it without the problem that they had before, that was like they wrote their own license, and they were, it was kind of Portuguese translated into English that was legal, so no one used that. So when they found like this open source community, finally it took off, and today is used especially for embedded systems, in programs in telephones or different kind of electronic devices.
So it's not commercial, it's an open access
yeah, it's
project.
open source completely. That is one of the interesting things about the programming language.
I don't want to use my privilege here to ask questions only by myself. Who wants, please, Nikos.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I thought that was really fascinating. So many little things jumped up for me. But I just got to share a little story with you. I'm not sure, you probably know this better than me, but the founding moments of anthropology with fieldwork notes, we normally associate that with someone going out into the field with a notebook, like Malinowski. But preceding that was Alfred Haddon, who went out to the Torres Strait Islands with a camera. And so the camera was there at the very, very first moment of fieldwork. And so that's been an important element that's almost been suppressed, only to be rediscovered much later in the 60s when visual anthropology took off again. So there's an interesting history between ethnography, fieldwork, and recording. And of course, the first camera was a static camera, and the only way in which the indigenous people could be photographed and filmed was as if they were on a stage. So the camera was fixed like it was as if it was in a cinema, and from left stage, the natives were asked to parade. And so the whole thing was captured as if it was on a theatre. But what is interesting in all this is that in this way there was this hybrid representation modalities. The camera, the theatre, the field, the stage, the notation were all mixed together. But this is just a sort of anecdote. I know you're very interested in the history of these.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a wonderful observation. One of the slides that I finally removed from the presentation, it was like the presentation of this book by Michael Tausig that is called I Swear I Saw This, right? That is about exactly the field work and the book notes, like people go back in time and eventually find like crazy things there. And that's one thing that I use to demonstrate that going to field work always implies that you are projecting things, right? It's a negotiation between your state of mind and your imagination and the relationship with the landscape and the variations of nature around you. Another thing that is very important to know is that eventually there is always somehow a scenic component to this, like a theatrical component to this. The beginning of when I mentioned Nanook, the film, you must remember that originally Flaherty went to do like his filming there, And finally, the footage was damaged, and he needed to go back, and they actually reenact all the scenes. So what we consider the beginning of anthropological cinema, ethnographic cinema, is all mise en scène, right? But I don't think that is that problematic, that condition. It's part of the way how we create relationships with reality, but it's very bad when you don't know it and when you give it for granted. So thanks for that reference. I probably will knock your door to know more about this. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us that originally Mick Tausig should be here.
Yeah.
Michael Tausig was invited and he said, yes, with pleasure I will come, but unfortunately he couldn't come finally, who is the master for notebooks, field books, and perhaps another time. Jeffrey, please.
Andrés, thanks a lot. Wonderful presentation. Look, I just want to add let's say an affirmation of the value of this fieldwork strategy from the point of view of the School of Creative Media in Hong Kong, because one of our faculty, Professor Scott Hazels, launched a program that has been running now for 3 years called Extreme Environments.
Oh, wow.
And he takes students out to extreme environments. So the first year he took them to the desert in California. The second year he took students to Antarctica. And the third year he took students to very recently discovered caves in Vietnam. And I assure you, and each time students went, their job was basically to do scientific research, to gather data, and to then use this data in the creation of artworks, which would then constitute an exhibition, which would then be the evidence of their experience. But I have to tell you that I know for a fact that for these students, these experiences were life transformatory, absolutely. And not only that, there is another interesting phenomena, and that is the students who went to the desert in California feel a very special alignment with the students who went to Antarctica, with the students who went to Vietnam. They have become a community of adventurers, right, who have been to these great places and can come back and share fabulous stories.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. What's the name again of the professor?
Extreme environments, because he's especially looking at environments which are under threat, where there are ecological sort of issues that can be studied.
One of the international artists who is doing this kind of, or using this kind of methods is Olafur Eliasson. Even if you don't like his artwork so much, or design work, however you want to put it, but his methods, his teaching methods include this kind of very, very severe and serious investigations in parts of the world which are very difficult to access, and it has an enormous consequence and effect on the students who is working with them. If I may, there's no... oh, yes, there is. Clemens, bitte.
I have a question. You present. I interpret your presentation as a, I guess, insight into the way you teach design. You mentioned Benjamin Bratton, so I suppose you're very fond of a speculative design approach. I suppose what you also presented is an approach that's not based around problem solving or a conventional functionalist, form follows function design approach, but a speculative one that doesn't try to solve the problems that can be identified. What I'm very curious about is what the students make of it, how they engage with this unconventional way of teaching design, and how they take it into the world that comes after university.
Sure. You're right, totally right. I mean, you know probably that last year Dunan Raby moved to the States, so now we are able to be in contact more with them. We had like for one class last semester, and 3 hours Skype session with them, showing one exercise on critical design. So what we're doing in Bogota is the following. Our city, despite has like 8 million people, it doesn't have a metro. And terrible traffic, as you can imagine. And we did research on the history of all the times that the metro was proposed. And there were like serious attempts to build the metro since the 50s. You know, in the 50s was one version, in the 60s, in the 70s, and 80s, and 90s. And what we did, like several projects, but probably the one that is more interesting is that we designed a map of Bogota as it had all the metros that were proposed. And it was, you know, sent for circulation. And people were very surprised to see that, you know, piece of design, very, you know, carefully done, at the same time talking about something that doesn't exist. And that was like the operational critical component of it. Students were very engaged with the exercise, despite some, you know, most of them have like background in more product design or communication design. They really enjoy the exercise of using their tools as ways of asking questions about the world, the immediate world there of in the city. I hope that answers your question.
Christine Wilke here on the back. Visitors from Berlin. She came far away.
Hello, thank you very much for this great presentation. I found it very interesting that you introduced, or the introduction to the digital arts part of your presentation was made by your ayahuasca experience. And I was wondering if this is just a personal coincidence, or if this has something to do with maybe a deeper connection between the digital arts and the power of the healing plants?
Listen, what I found more interesting of these kind of experiences is that those experiences stay in your mind. Let's say that ayahuasca ceremony that I attended by chance taught me something very strange. I've been trying to make sense of that image and that experience that I got for more than 20 years. And after thinking several times on it, finally, I think I found a clear way on how I can interpret that. I think somehow it was like a call from the future, right? You will be interested in this. And it's how I'm chewing that now. Similar to that, there are like some theoreticians that said that experiences that William Burroughs had in exactly the same place, like this kind of the same town there in Colombia, had a similar impact. That was, you know, one particular moment in his life, but then he talked about those experiences for a long while. And I think that's a very interesting way of seeing it. Because eventually the approach of, you know, recreative experience that has no meaning could hide this powerful mystery it has inside that is finally, in a way, a connection with your unconscious world.
Hello? Yeah, maybe just to be more precise, as it is an indigenous plant from that region, maybe I was more interested in if there's an interconnection to this connection to the indigenous words, like also in this book that you showed, the code had like this indigenous structures, patterns. And if you see that, and maybe in South America, there's more like an interconnection between this kind of different code words.
Yeah. One of the reasons I went to do projects in the field is because of the great respect I have for indigenous communities in several ways. Let's say Navajo code talkers in New Mexico, these indigenous communities in the Amazon, the indigenous community in northern Quebec. I think we usually think that indigenous knowledge is a relic of the past, but I think they have things, a lot of things to teach us about our present, and that part of my work is trying to engage with that, those levels in the most serious way I can.
I'm sorry, I have to look a little bit on the watch, Andrés. This is nearly already some kind of a bridge for our next presentation. This is always what I admired in your work, this wonderful respect for the living in a very deep sense. Your practice now of ornithology is perhaps the most lively example for that, and I can only agree. The Institute of Ornithology in Bogota is one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. They had wonderful publications, wonderful books from the 19th century and even earlier. And everybody who comes to Bogota, you must go to the Institute for Ornithology and look at the painted birds. Michael, one last.
Just very last two aspects. One relating to the let's say psychedelic experiences. We know that as well the Buffalo School in the early 80s for media art. All the video synthesizers were created under the influence of the experiences of the artists of that time, of psychedelic, all kinds of psychedelic experiences. This was just very small remark that there is an obvious link between kind of synthetic, first early analog synthetic image and psychedelic experiences. There is no doubt. This is one aspect. The other, you just confirm through your wonderful presentation and very diverse and dense, and I wish more students of us would have seen it. Just also my modest approach here within the school. Since 12 years, every new student group which appear in the school, I do a seminar once a year called Get Out of the University of the HFG, which is the name of our school, to just through this metaphorical get out is just you are here just to look at it from outside and let's go to the field. So this is like a regular ritual, and the other one long term is called go public. We go on a regular basis in a local but also international field spaces. I think this is an elementary experience for any art student to get a distance to the time, space one operates. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Michael. You can see whenever a Colombian is in a room, you talk about drugs. Thank you very much, Andrés.